Independent membership organisation means we can speak with a united and confident voice on behalf of the sector as a whole. The MA will continue to champion and celebrate the difference that museums make, and we can all make the case for the institutions we're passionate about, whether it's chatting at the school gate, with our families and friends, or with the public that visit us. We can all be advocates for our amazing museums.
As a rep, I tell people here in Northern Ireland what the MA offers and keep them up to date with MA policy and publications, but also I feed a lot of information back to the MA about what's happening here on the ground and really give them a flavour of the exciting projects that's happening here in Northern Ireland. I would encourage people to join the MA because being a member gives you access to a big window that shows you what's happening in the sector UK-wide. Personally speaking, it's really easy to become focused on what you do in your museum and have tunnel vision, but being a member of the MA opens up a new world to you really of what's happening.
In terms of best practice, the Museums Association is really leading the way with their Museums Change Lives initiatives. That's a programme where lots of different museums of different sizes and scales can really buy into in terms of the health and well-being agenda and embracing change, working towards improving social impact within the museum sector. It also offers lots of opportunities for training and events and continuing professional development, such as the Transformers programme.
It inspires you, you learn about projects that are happening in other museums and how really we all face similar struggles and we can all help each other. You're informed by the Museum's Journal every month and there's so much to read and so much to see. You're really part of a rich network of museum professionals.
I'm delighted to be part of the group of staff and board members who have responsibility for making sure the MA is enacting its nation's policy. It's absolutely essential that board and staff have a deep understanding of the different political contexts across the four nations, the different legislation, the different approaches to culture, the different funding opportunities that exist. So the MA has developed relationships with cultural units within the different governments. So they're talking to policymakers, they have a relationship with the people who are making decisions that affect the museums sector across the different nations. I go so far as to say the Museums Association takes the lead in advocacy for museums.
Museums Change Lives is the Museums Association's flagship campaign, and it promotes the work that museums are doing to enhance health and well-being, create better places for us to live and work, and provide safe space for debate and reflection. But at a time when public funding is under increasing pressure, we also know it's vital that we're able to articulate that value to stakeholders. And that's why the Museums Association is running an advocacy campaign to demonstrate that museums are worth investing in and supporting. We regularly meet with governments across the UK. We provide the data, the case studies and the evidence to convince those decision makers that museums deserve recognition and investment. In the past year, we have collaborated with other sector bodies to hold events in Westminster and the Senedd that have enabled us and our members to have conversations with politicians at a senior level. The fact that we're an independent membership organisation means we can speak with a united and confident voice on behalf of the sector as a whole. The MA will continue to champion and celebrate the difference that museums make, and we can all make the case for the institutions we're passionate about, whether it's chatting at the school gate, with our families and friends, or with the public that visit us. We can all be advocates for our amazing museums.
As a rep, I tell people here in Northern Ireland what the MA offers and keep them up to date with MA policy and publications, but also I feed a lot of information back to the MA about what's happening here on the ground and really give them a flavour of the exciting projects that's happening here in Northern Ireland. I would encourage people to join the MA because being a member gives you access to a big window that shows you what's happening in the sector UK-wide. Personally speaking, it's really easy to become focused on what you do in your museum and have tunnel vision, but being a member of the MA opens up a new world to you really of what's happening.
In terms of best practice, the Museums Association is really leading the way with their Museums Change Lives initiatives. That's a programme where lots of different museums of different sizes and scales can really buy into in terms of the health and wellbeing agenda and embracing change, working towards improving social impact within the museum sector. It also offers lots of opportunities for training and events and continuing professional development, such as the Transformers programme.
It inspires you, you learn about projects that are happening in other museums and how really we all face similar struggles and we can all help each other. You're informed by the Museum's Journal every month and there's so much to read and so much to see. You're really part of a rich network of museum professionals.
I'm delighted to be part of the group of staff and board members who have responsibility for making sure the MA is enacting its nation's policy. It's absolutely essential that board and staff have a deep understanding of the different political contexts across the four nations, the different legislation, the different approaches to culture, the different funding opportunities that exist. So the MA has developed relationships with cultural units within the different governments. So they're talking to policymakers, they have a relationship with the people who are making decisions that affect the museums sector across the different nations. I'd go so far as to say the Museums Association takes the lead in advocacy for museums.
Museums Change Lives is the Museums Association's flagship campaign and it promotes the work that museums are doing to enhance health and wellbeing, create better places for us to live and work and provide safe space for debate and reflection. But at a time when public funding is under increasing pressure, we also know it's vital that we're able to articulate that value to stakeholders. And that's why the Museums Association is running an advocacy campaign to demonstrate that museums are worth investing in and supporting. We regularly meet with governments across the UK. We provide the data, the case studies and the evidence to convince those decision makers that museums deserve recognition and investment. In the past year, we have collaborated with other sector bodies to hold events in Westminster and the Senedd that have enabled us and our members to have conversations with politicians at a senior level. The fact that we're an independent membership organisation means we can speak with a united and confident voice on behalf of the sector as a whole. The MA will continue to champion and celebrate the difference that museums make, and we can all make the case for the institutions we're passionate about, whether it's chatting at the school gate, with our families and friends, or with the public that visit us. We can all be advocates for our amazing museums.
As a rep, I tell people here in Northern Ireland what the MA offers and keep them up to date with MA policy and publications, but also I feed a lot of information back to the MA about what's happening here on the ground and really give them a flavour of the exciting projects that's happening here in Northern Ireland. I would encourage people to join the MA because being a member gives you access to a big window that shows you what's happening in the sector UK-wide. Personally speaking, it's really easy to become focused on what you do in your museum and have tunnel vision, but being a member of the MA opens up a new world to you really of what's happening.
In terms of best practice, the Museums Association is really leading the way with their Museums Change Lives initiatives. That's a programme where lots of different museums of different sizes and scales can really buy into in terms of the health and wellbeing agenda and embracing change, working towards improving social impact within the museum sector. It also offers lots of opportunities for training and events and continuing professional development, such as the Transformers programme.
It inspires you, you learn about projects that are happening in other museums and how really we all face similar struggles and we can all help each other. You're informed by the Museum's Journal every month and there's so much to read and so much to see. You're really part of a rich network of museum professionals.
I'm delighted to be part of the group of staff and board members who have responsibility for making sure the MA is enacting its nation's policy. It's absolutely essential that board and staff have a deep understanding of the different political contexts across the four nations, the different legislation, the different approaches to culture, the different funding opportunities that exist. So the MA has developed relationships with cultural units within the different governments. So they're talking to policymakers, they have a relationship with the people who are making decisions that affect the museums sector across the different nations. I go so far as to say the Museums Association takes the lead in advocacy for museums.
Museums Change Lives is the Museums Association's flagship campaign, and it promotes the work that museums are doing to enhance health and well-being, create better places for us to live and work, and provide safe space for debate and reflection. But at a time when public funding is under increasing pressure, we also know it's vital that we're able to articulate that value to stakeholders. And that's why the Museums Association is running an advocacy campaign to demonstrate that museums are worth investing in and supporting. We regularly meet with governments across the UK. We provide the data, the case studies and the evidence to convince those decision makers that museums deserve recognition and investment. In the past year, we have collaborated with other sector bodies to hold events in Westminster and the Senedd that have enabled us and our members to have conversations with politicians at a senior level. The fact that we're an independent membership organisation means we can speak with a united and confident voice on behalf of the sector as a whole. The MA will continue to champion and celebrate the difference that museums make, and we can all make the case for the institutions we're passionate about, whether it's chatting at the school gate, with our families and friends, or with the public that visit us. We can all be advocates for our amazing museums.
As a rep, I tell people here in Northern Ireland what the MA offers and keep them up to date with MA policy and publications, but also I feed a lot of information back to the MA about what's happening here on the ground and really give them a flavour of the exciting projects that's happening here in Northern Ireland. I would encourage people to join the MA because being a member gives you access to a big window that shows you what's happening in the sector UK-wide. Personally speaking, it's really easy to become focused on what you do in your museum and have tunnel vision, but being a member of the MA opens up a new world to you really of what's happening.
In terms of best practice, the Museums Association is really leading the way with their Museums Change Lives initiatives. That's a programme where lots of different museums of different sizes and scales can really buy into in terms of the health and well-being agenda and embracing change, working towards improving social impact within the museum sector. It also offers lots of opportunities for training and events and continuing professional development such as the Transformers programme.
It inspires you, you learn about projects that are happening in other museums and how really we all face similar struggles and we can all help each other. You're informed by the Museum's Journal every month and there's so much to read and so much to see. You're really part of a rich network of museum professionals.
I'm delighted to be part of the group of staff and board members who have responsibility for making sure the MA is enacting its nation's policy. It's absolutely essential that board and staff have a deep understanding of the different political contexts across the four nations, the different legislation, the different approaches to culture, the different funding opportunities that exist. So the MA has developed relationships with cultural units within the different governments. So they're talking to policymakers, they have a relationship with the people who are making decisions that affect the museums sector across the different nations. I go so far as to say the Museums Association takes the lead in advocacy for museums.
Museums Change Lives is the Museums Association's flagship campaign, and it promotes the work that museums are doing to enhance health and well-being, create better places for us to live and work, and provide safe space for debate and reflection. But at a time when public funding is under increasing pressure, we also know it's vital that we're able to articulate that value to stakeholders. And that's why the Museums Association is running an advocacy campaign to demonstrate that museums are worth investing in and supporting. We regularly meet with governments across the UK. We provide the data, the case studies and the evidence to convince those decision makers that museums deserve recognition and investment. In the past year, we have collaborated with other sector bodies to hold events in Westminster and the Senedd that have enabled us and our members to have conversations with politicians at a senior level. The fact that we're an independent membership organisation means we can speak with a united and confident voice on behalf of the sector as a whole. The MA will continue to champion and celebrate the difference that museums make, and we can all make the case for the institutions we're passionate about, whether it's chatting at the school gate, with our families and friends, or with the public that visit us. We can all be advocates for our amazing museums.
As a rep, I tell people here in Northern Ireland what the MA offers and keep them up to date with MA policy and publications, but also I feed a lot of information back to the MA about what's happening here on the ground and really give them a flavour of the exciting projects that's happening here in Northern Ireland. I would encourage people to join the MA because
Okay, good morning everybody. You're very welcome to the second day of the conference. It feels bright and early, but already Sharon Heal has been working on all our behalfs. She undertook an interview with Radio Ulster, was invited to speak from the warm... So Sharon was invited to discuss from the War Memorial Museum the role of the Museums Association and discuss the conference. And it's a really good example, I think, of how important it is that the Museums Association's conferences are held in different places every year and that they're really rooted in those places and that the broader public and community has an opportunity to hear about the work of the association and also of the range of museums that exist across the islands. Can I also bring your attention to, there are some publications on the stage. You're welcome to take these away. These are locally produced. One is a toolkit of 75 local and varied case studies on remembering the centenaries. We're still in the middle of a decade of centenaries in Ireland, and the other captures reflections on learning. I'd also like to thank, on behalf of the Museums Association, the British Council, for supporting the MA to bring Elaine Human-Gurian and Americo Casilla to the conference. And I'd like to remind you of a fringe event, the Department for International Trade lunch, which is between 12:30 and 10 to 2 this afternoon. And it's organised to represent the relationship between Hong Kong and the United Kingdom. Hong Kong is a key market for the Department of International Trade's Creative Industries team. It has a vibrant museum sector and is an important factor in the desire to create closer links between the museum communities in the two countries. So as part of this, we are delighted to welcome to the conference a distinguished team from Hong Kong and to mark their presence by hosting a networking lunch in the Ark. This delegation has been organised by our colleagues at the British Council in Hong Kong, and we look forward to seeing both them and their guests, or we have enjoyed seeing them at the conference, and we look forward to the lunch this afternoon. One last piece of advice, I suppose: don't forget to visit the exhibition space today if you haven't already. It really is just the most energising, in so many ways uplifting space because of the variety, the dedication and the originality of many of the things on show. So it was a grey morning. It wasn't as nice. I took a photograph of Belfast yesterday morning. It looked so good at 7 o'clock. Didn't look quite so good this morning. It's a more typical grey Belfast day. It reminded me of Tom Paulin said of Northern Ireland in the 1990s. It was like the end of Waiting for Godot. Nothing happens. Nobody comes. Nobody goes. It's awful. It's a society sometimes where certainly politicians encourage stasis. There sometimes feels like there's this strangulation of any attempt to change or reform, but there has been massive change. I remember when Belfast City Centre was a security zone, there was nothing, there was no nightlife in the city centre. And it's taken a long time to create what we have now. And it's extraordinary what we have now. I was overhearing people deciding where they were going to go for dinner and just thinking how incredible that change has been. There are still issues, obviously, in the society when even cakes aren't allowed to express their own sexuality. But we can see the power of the museum sector and think about last night in the Ulster Museum. And the great awards, the inaugural awards for Museums Change Lives, recognising work that we were discussing it at dinner later, and it is work that often goes unrecognised. And someone made the point last night that very often dissent in any sector really, but particularly if you are reliant on funding, that sometimes that dissent has to be quite quiet, but nevertheless systematic, that sometimes it's the small acts that bring about gradual and really significant change. And we can see, I think, in this society, the Ulster Museum's role in that. And it was just lovely to be part of that event last night, there was nothing quiet about it. And it was just great to have museum people, I think, cheer and clap and support each other and support what it is you all do. I don't work in the museum sector. I work in a university in Middlesbrough. But every opportunity I get, I collaborate with the Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art because I find museums to be such creative spaces. I love the ethos of MIMA, and I feel it's a nourishing experience and relationship. So it's great to celebrate it. Some of the social media from last night will give you a sense of how it went. Simon Brown tweeted, "How's your night going? I'm watching a drag queen dressed as a mermaid sing Creep in the foyer of the Ulster Museum." And that really is something I didn't think I'd ever read. Jenny tweeted, "Ain't no party like a museum conference party." Charlotte Morgan, "Brilliant evening to round off the first day of the museum's 2018 with wine, awards, dippy and drag queens at the Ulster Museum." And earlier in the day, Richard Sandel had tweeted, "One of the most inspiring openings to the Museum Association conference ever, compelling provocations on dissent and its place in museums." And Navajo Mangat quoted Sarah Wajid, who had reminded us of the need to take risks and to have difficult conversations to make change. And I think that challenge that was set down to us yesterday continues today and will continue in this morning's conversation, a conversation with directors, and I'm going to hand over to Jenny Stewart to chair that event. Thank you.
Morning, everybody. So we've discovered we only have 2 microphones, so we're going to be doing a lot of passing. You'll all have to be like, unfailingly polite and read each other's body language when you're ready to talk. It means I won't talk at all, so that's a relief for everybody. So welcome to Directors in Conversation. I'm joined by Kim Street, Chief Executive of Museums Sheffield, Catherine Thompson, CEO and Director of National Museums Northern Ireland, Lynn Scarf, Director, National Museum of Ireland, and Hilary McGrady, Director General of the National Trust. So I think we're going to try and keep it informal and chatty, microphones lying, and we're going to chat for about 40 minutes, does that sound? And then I'm going to try and leave 20 minutes at the end for questions, so no pressure, get your questions ready. It's like a third of the session. So I thought the first thing we could talk about would be participatory practice, which I managed to say in one go, that's good. It's, the MA obviously have published their toolkit around participatory practice, and Arts Council England recently published their Cultural Democracy Report, so I did some research. So it feels like kind of co-creation, co-commissioning, all things participatory are in the air, and I thought it might be interesting to maybe pull out some of the tensions there, tensions between welcoming in the public and making them a bigger part of what we do and how we run museums, but at the same time, making sure we're championing expertise and the kind of specialist knowledge of the people that we work with. And maybe also, what do you think are the challenges or solutions of scaling up participatory practice so it includes and benefits as many people as possible?
Handed it to me, Jenny.
Or you guys can jump in. Okay.
It's terrible going first. No, that's what I get for saying first. No, I mean it's interesting, and I would be somebody that would very much welcome participatory practice. I think it's crucial. I think it's really important in terms of how museums are relevant to their audiences. I think there are tensions there, for sure, and I think it's about making space for diverse expertise, and maybe that's really about how we explore that tension, recognizing that within our institutions we have significant expertise in terms of our collections and our curatorship and so on, but also thinking about how when we develop programs we make space for a different kind of expertise. And I think participatory programming is interesting because I think oftentimes in organizations, depending on the structure, it ends up maybe living in the education and learning end of house, right? And I don't know if people in the audience would agree, but oftentimes the education and learning end of house is where these things come in, and it takes longer for that shift to maybe happen in other areas. And one of the things that I'm struck by is that there was a recent exhibition in our museum in Turlough Park, our Museum of Country Life, called Traveller's Journey. Which is a wonderful exhibition if anybody gets to see it. But that came out of a co-curatorship of our curator Rosa Meehan with the traveller community. But crucially, and I think this is the thing that we need to remember about this, it took time. It takes resources, it's about relationships, it's about developing trust. And that tension, I think, around expertise often comes up if it's rushed, if people feel threatened, on both sides, both within the organisation and outside of the organisation. So I think that's something to kind of think about when we're launching into this. Kim, I think. Kim's
fighting for the mic. I was thinking about the tension a little bit. I think that there is a tension, and it's not always about expertise. I think sometimes it's about having confidence to be able to build relationships over a long period of time. And to be able to really listen and to put yourself out there. So there's something about the confidence, I think, and we talked a lot about power in this conference, but to relinquish that control. So it's less about challenge to expertise and more about being able to be confident that this is a good way to approach things, and knowing that actually by opening up, you're not diminishing your expertise. In fact, what you're doing is building your expertise, you're listening, you're seeing things from different perspectives. And I think that takes a lot of time. And certainly if I look at our organisation, you can see some really brilliant practice but it's not embedded throughout. So I think one of the things I have as a tension is, as you reflected on, that notion that participatory practice sits within the community team, with the learning team. The real challenge, I think, for us is how do you embed that across the piece? You know, we're all people, we're all human beings. How do we embed that curiosity about other people across all areas of practice? And for me, that's a tension around resource and confidence and training. You were fighting for it.
No. I mean, I think we're all in danger of agreeing with ourselves violently here. Participation is completely, I mean, there isn't really any debate as that is something that we have to do. Apart from anything else, feeling as if you're part of what, in our case, the National Trust is about, that's part of the benefit that we bring, people feeling involved and feeling wanting to be part of it. So I would concur with the need for confidence, but I always think if you come at something, if we start with the word tension, you already start up, you set up the frame to be, there's a problem here. In fact, we're trying to reframe it in the Trust, and it is not easy about the opportunity around it. And actually, we've seen some amazing things, and we're in the foothills of this as well, because we're an organisation that is, you know, likes to control things, and actually just building the picture of what's possible, building on the positivity around it rather than the concerns around it. And there will always be the need for the specialist, always, 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 because, I mean, apart from anything else, quality is one of our real concerns, making sure, but there is no reason why participation should mean lower quality, and that's I'm quite passionate about that sense of it'll mean it's dumbed down. It won't, it'll mean it's better. So building on the positivity around it and building on that sort of what the future might look, I think feels to me a better frame.
Yeah, I mean, and I would concur with a lot of what's said. I suppose sometimes I think maybe we create the tension for ourselves. I'm a bit of a blow into the museum sector, so I've been on a very fast learning curve with words like participation and participatory practice and all the vocabulary that you have in the museum sector. And my view is, and the way I see it, is that when we look at participation as something that we should do, it kind of sits as a bolt-on or around the edge, whereas it should just be our way of being. And I think it's not about saying that you get rid of expertise or you have to bring in participation. It's how everybody works together, and it's more to do with culture, I think, and how you properly embed it into your organisation.
Good, excellent. Third use of the word blow-in that I've heard so far. I don't know if that's a phrase that people who aren't from this island will recognise. You're learning about all kinds of things. So I guess it feels like one of the things you're saying is that it involves lots of time and lots of work, and that really how you can make it work is by giving that resource to the people that are in the organisation, and that rather than be a and, which is what happens sometimes when it gets siloed into learning, it needs to be a instead of. It needs to be instead of working in a different way. So I wonder if any of you have examples of where you've used participatory practice, where it's worked for you.
Yeah, we had
show off for a moment.
One recently where, in this case, it was particularly about working with children with particularly severe autism. And while we've done lots of little programmes around that, we actually, at one of our properties in Croom, in the Midlands, invited the families involved to allow the children themselves, 8-year-olds, to decide, that in this case, they were developing a trail. And so these children themselves spotted the bits of the property that, in some shape or form, they responded to. So they chose the places, they chose which artist. We would then get to develop the actual trail for them, and the parents themselves organised how the trail came around. It was a terrifying thing for the property too. They had no say other than to facilitate this activity to happen. But the result has been completely astonishing. It's just, the children themselves, of course, have had huge benefit out of it, but actually the process by which we followed has been, that's been the revelation for the property. So it's about building confidence, great quality product, great quality experience, not nearly as scary as they thought it was going to be. So building the confidence, and now they're off to the next one and the next one. And for me, it is about talking and planning never really works. Do something and then build from there.
I just have to say how surreal it is to be on this stage. I come here to see famous people. The last person I saw here was Jimmy Carr, and he was very funny and will not be half as funny. So it's very strange to be sitting on the stage here in Belfast. Anyway, I think for us, and we talk about participation, and I know a lot of you were in the Ulster Museum last night, and you'll have the opportunity to see the Troubles Gallery. That's a project we couldn't have delivered without participation. It was a very challenging project, and I know my colleague Karen will be talking about it later on this afternoon, so she'll be much better on this subject than I am. But I think because it's contested, it's very difficult. If we hadn't worked in collaboration right through from an academic advisory group to all of the community groups we worked with, to the community collecting workshops that we had, we have a number of objects in the gallery that are on loan. That's not, it's a really difficult story to tell. It's not our story, it's a shared story. And so it's very important for us. Participation was critical, I think, for that project to be successful and for it to have credibility.
I'll just give you an example from Sheffield. We, like lots of people in this room, have been having a year where we've really looked at protest and activism and what that means. And for a city like Sheffield, I mean, activism runs in our blood, and over the last couple of years, we've been doing quite a lot of work around that. One of the things that worked well for us was a protest lab where we were inviting people to talk about and tell us in preparation for a series of exhibitions, what protests, what causes mattered most to them. And, you know, as you'd imagine, with a massive spectrum of causes, one of the things that really came through was humanity. Again, you know, the Chilean solidarity movement, for example, in Sheffield, really very big. Truth and Justice for Orgreave, a massive, massive campaign in South Yorkshire. But then also things like the Tree campaign. I don't know if you're aware of Sheffield and its street trees, but there's this whole programme to replace the pavements, and in that, the trees are under attack in certain streets. So that figured very largely for us. And personally, it's very difficult because you know, you kind of think about human causes, and I'm now kind of struggling slightly with trees, but then it is a human cause. It's about, you know, campaigning for something that matters most for you. So through Protest Lab, we were able to hear the things that mattered most to the people of Sheffield and then translate that with them into a series of exhibitions throughout this year. And that's been really very successful. I think the big thing for us is what next, and how do we use that lab format to invite further conversations and further debates through the programme from here on in. So it's not just about protest, but about everything that we do.
I was talking about the example of the traveller's journey earlier on, but I think one of the things that's interesting to think about as a challenge in this space is that for a lot of museums like ourselves and the National Museum that have a significant collection, which we're trying to, you know, get out and get our audiences engaged in, thinking about participatory programming in that context is a tricky piece. You know, how do you start thinking about that? And one of the things that strikes me is that sometimes a thematic approach within that kind of work is oftentimes interesting. So, you know, rather than, you know, looking at things, you know, in our permanent exhibitions or so on from a chronological perspective or from very specific academic kind of or museum, but taking big themes that resonate with people, things like trauma and love and, you know, memory and so on, and using that approach to our collections as ways to invite open calls in for artists and community groups to respond to that and to actually allow them to play with our collection in that context in some way. And I think that there's sort of two things that kind of need to happen. One is about those kind of programs that invite people in to shape, but actually another piece is thinking about how we program at an exhibition level and how we open that out even. And can be a big shift change, I think, for organisations and beginning that process. Yeah.
So do you mean as in getting your audiences to tell you what you should be programming rather than developing it yourself? Is that what you?
I suppose, I mean, doing it together actually is offering that out, thinking about what that looks like, and crucially the processes that enable that. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I've actually heard quite a lot throughout the conference, which is, like, you know, you guys talking about the Troubles Gallery, but, you know, God, we thought we were going to get absolute pelters for this, and then it was fine. People really went for it. And that people do unexpected things whenever you invite them in, that you think they're going to like come and protest about, you know, globalism, but really they just want to talk about trees. And that's totally fine. That's brilliant.
And they did protest. They at the opening of the exhibition, they came en masse with the placards, dressed in tree costumes. It was a really full-on demonstration. And I think the thing that was great about that, I mean, this is an exhibition we did that had over 30 different causes throughout Sheffield's history, many of them very raw and very contemporary. But I think what was interesting was that they saw that space as a space to demonstrate and to challenge the sort of civic and the council and so on. Took a bit of organising, I have to say, but it was really good, and I think that sort of tells you how much agency there is, but also how museums as spaces for debate and challenge are really important.
Yeah. I think maybe you've done it deliberately, but you've segued beautifully into the next topic of conversation. Top marks. So I thought we could talk about museum activism a little bit. So obviously it's sort of weaved through this conference. And alongside this kind of growing interest and desire to see museums as an activist space, there's also seems that there's a growing challenge to the idea that museums ever have been or could be neutral. And maybe particularly in the context of Northern Ireland or Ireland, but not specifically, of course. I wondered if maybe we could talk about whether is there a value in striving to be neutral, of finding some way to be neutral? Should we give up on the concept that we could ever do it? Is it a bad idea? They're all looking at me like they do not want me to give them the microphone.
I don't think we'd ever want to be neutral. And so I think it depends how you approach something. And in the context of Troubles for us, I think what was important is being representative and allowing lots of different voices to speak at the same time. But I think, as you've just been saying, Kim, the importance particularly for us around that gallery is about creating a space. It's a shared space, it's a safe place, but we like to think it's a place where we can ask difficult questions and where people can actually have their perceptions challenged and have that debate and that dialogue. And I would completely support what you said in terms of that's a really critical role that I think museums can play, whatever topic we're looking at within the societies in which they exist.
Just to add to that, I mean, I don't think we are, and I don't think we can be, and just reflecting on our year, we've reflected activism in the city, and we did have a lot of discussions about what exactly was in there. And through Protest Lab, what we saw was a very left-leaning city. It's a very left-wing city, and our exhibition in the end was very radical and very left-wing. And I make absolutely no apology for that. But what I really struggle with is how would that be if we were in a city that was very right-wing? How would we deal with that? And I think, now there's this huge, rise of fascism throughout Europe. We have Trump, say no more. How would we tackle that in the museum? Well, we tried to tackle that. But I think we kind of struggled with, well, what would happen? What would happen if we had, we know we've got English Defence League, for example, quite active in South Yorkshire. Should that be represented? Should we be putting that in the museum? Well, we're not a neutral space, and I think we have to own what is on display. We have to own it. We have to accept that people visiting it, our councillors, our stakeholders, will align us with what we're displaying. And I think for that reason, we have to really own it and stand up for it, speak out for it. And so for me, there's no apologies about it. I think we need to be really very clear. And I wouldn't be prepared, I think, to give a platform for right-wing stuff without some really serious questioning about what this is saying and some real challenge to those behaviours.
I think for me, the question around museums are not neutral, it's an incredibly powerful slogan, but it requires you to kind of dig into it a bit. And for me, it's not, I don't think we are neutral, or I completely agree that we could ever be, but I think it's actually, the question's more about relevance. And I think Kim's talked very eloquently about being relevant to that audience in Sheffield. And when you get into that tricky spot where you think about what you're doing and the relevance to your users, to your audience, and then you think about, well, are we in a bubble here in terms of who that? But I think that's where you reflect back to your values as an organization. And I'm a big believer, like you know, to hell with the mission and the vision and all that stuff. Like, yes, that's important. But what are the values of your organization? How do you live, breathe? How do you pick the phone up? How do you welcome your visitors? And they should be kind of consistent and coherent. And I think when for museums in these kind of difficult periods of significant social change, what's really important as an organization is that you as an organization debate, look at your values, think of those in the context of this current time, and then use those along with thinking about being relevant to your audience. So I think that hopefully by bringing those together, it allows you a little bit to navigate this difficult space and have those difficult conversations, but at least have something so that you don't all feel like you're constantly being bombarded. Well, if you're doing this, why aren't you doing this? Or, you know, if you're doing this for this audience, why aren't you? And being drawn into that partisan piece. So for me, it always goes back to relevance. Everything has to go back to that question of, you know, is your work relevant to your audience? And all of the different sectors of such, you know, and obviously there's lots of different ones.
Yes, I completely concur about relevance. None of our properties were ever neutral. Their very being was the fact they're not neutral spaces, and we would never want to make them bland. However, there's something for me in respecting people's different perspectives, you know, at all time. And even if that's really uncomfortable, I think there is something about understanding that you're putting yourself in their shoes and understanding at least where they're coming from, even if you don't agree with them. And how to get that balance is really tricky, I have to say, and I'm finding it in the Trust. Just to refer, I had an example yesterday. Some of you will have picked up in the press about the covering up of the paintings and the busts. And I had 2 letters that arrived on my desk yesterday. First one, and I'm abbreviating, but it said, you're an abhorrent organisation. I demand that you cover up all female paintings now, because at the end of the day, it was the men that went to war, it was the men that do the work, and the women sit at home painting their nails. Letter number 1. Letter number 2 was, you're an amazing organisation. Thank you so much for, you know, bringing forward the story of women in history that has largely been untold. And it's that sense of, well, what do I do with that then? How do I balance that? Well, you have to then hold to your values. The Trust is an extraordinary organisation. There is an expectation of what people expect to get from us, and in a way we're constantly trying to provoke that a little bit, to make people think, why is that history that they're now looking at relevant to what they're living today. So that relevance for me is the thing you need to go back to, but you've got to hold on. Got to hold on to those values and understanding that other people are coming from different perspectives.
I'm up again. So do any of you think that you're, I haven't planned this question, so I'm just thinking. Do any of you think that your comfort with the idea of activism, and particularly activism which, let's face it, is left-leaning, is because you feel like you're counteracting what has been an overwhelmingly conservative, more right-winging lean in institutions, you know, up until now? Do you feel like you're compensating for a non-neutral past that was non-neutral in a different direction? Does that make sense? No?
Yes, I think that's probably fair. Again, another letter yesterday said you're a vile liberal lefty. I get lovely letters.
You should just send them.
Yeah, but to be fair, I can see where they're coming from, because there is a sense that we have gone from a hugely much loved national treasure to this slightly, you're liberal lefty trying to change history, and there's something about taking responsibility for that. I do have, you know, members and a much wider supporter base that are slightly confused about what we're about. So my responsibility is to bring them with me, actually. It isn't, I'm not about trying to leave them over there. I think that would be a really wrong thing to do, to be honest. It is about bringing that community with us, and I'm really confident that we can, but we need to do that through inspiration, through provocation, through all of those things, rather than saying they're wrong.
To me, it's less about championing causes. I don't think we're there to champion causes. I think what we're there is to ask challenging questions and to challenge perceptions. So it's about representing the multiplicity of voices within the societies in which we exist and ensuring that it's representative, and then allowing that debate to happen. That's where I would see more of a role, rather than us being an activist that's going to champion any one person's cause, but it's being representative of the voices within the society.
If I heard your question right, Jenny, are you kind of asking, like, in terms of that, you know, museums are maybe traditionally much more hierarchical and conservative in nature, and are we sort of, is that?
What I mean is that, is, you know, I think it's brilliant that you so honestly said, like, we're quite comfortable with, we weren't so challenged with what would be characterized as more lefty activism in the museum space. But if someone came and wanted to do some more right-wing activism, like, God, would have to really sit down and think about it, because, like, that's, like, lefties are fine, but righties would be terrifying.
Oh. Well, I think, so for me it's interesting, because I think the thing that we can't do is think, so museums are always in the context of the current social or political context. You know, we're not separate from that in any kind of, you know, we're in it, and we have to respond to what's happening around us. And I suppose, so yes, at the moment in museums, and probably a lot of the ones sitting here and out there, more crucially, there's activities that are going on that are responding to the activism that's been kind of lit up by what we're experiencing in the world at the moment, and rightly so, in the social change. And it is you know, exactly what Catherine said, it's our role to engage in that. So I think it's less to do with what side, and more to do with, again, that piece of, you know, not being porous institutions. I think that's a phrase that I kind of like to think about, that there's a constant flow that, you know, between us, our audiences, and the communities that we work in, and making sure that we are that. Yeah.
And that ultimately goes back to relevance. So if you're engaging in the debates that people are having, then it's helping to create relevant spaces.
Yeah, and I would agree with that, but I suppose I'd just go back to your role, the individuals working in an organisation, and that you can't get away from the fact that you are making a choice in the decisions in the end that are being taken. And yes, you're doing that with people, you are, but your values are very important in that. So I think there's something about recognising that, and in thinking about a space for difficult questions to be asked and difficult conversations to happen, you need to understand your role in that. And so, I would make no apology for being left-leaning. I get the point that potentially we're in this little bubble where we're all cozy and we're all, I mean, it's a massive assumption, guys. You know, we're all left-leaning, but you know, I think there is something about what we bring to it as individuals. You know, we're asking the people that we're working with to give of their stories and of their memories and of their, you know, of their life experiences. But we've got a role in that as well. You know, we've got our stories and our experiences and our beliefs. And I think that what we're suggesting is that the museum is a space where we're bouncing that around. That yes, it's about relevance, but we're bringing something to that. We're not just a blank page, we're bringing something. And I think that's important. That it's important that we've got that passion and we've got that opinion. And that should then be part of that wider conversation. I think there's a validity to it.
I think there's some, when you were just speaking, Kim, that made me think about that's where sometimes our, you know, in particular, our collection and the objects that we have in our care can really come into play, because it is that piece of reflecting the past, and it is into the present in some respects, and thinking about the things that we have that in some way speak to those difficult opinions, or opinions that are entirely different to ours, and thinking about how we can use them to perhaps reach out and to have those kinds of difficult conversations. And I'm often struck by when people are telling a story through an object, how much easier that is sometimes for people, and how it provides it provides a focus. It almost takes all of the emotion on and holds it while the people in the room are struggling with it themselves. And maybe there's ways for us to think about that more in our spaces. And because there's things in our collection that sometimes we might not bring to the fore in that way, right?
Yeah, totally. It seems like it's not the stories or the things you're talking about that people find individually difficult. It's just the sense that they're being attacked and not listened to. You know, people's own histories and own families always have a radical bit and a conservative bit, and they enjoy celebrating both of those. But it's when they feel that the current of the conversation is cutting them out, that's a bit more difficult. That's what they react against.
I was going to say that there's something about relationships. Years and years ago, I did an oral history interview with a woman who had grown up in the industrial area of Sheffield, and her family were very poor, and her mum made costumes. She was a fantastic seamstress, and she would make costumes for the great and the good of Sheffield, and they would copy Chanel's suits. Anyway, this is a really interesting story, and I won't bore you with it, but she was picked up, the family were picked up by the Quakers, and the Quakers supported their family to get into education. So there's a story of social mobility right there. Anyway, in this long oral history interview, and we were listening and you know, built up a good relationship with this woman. And she, at one point, said to me, "But tell me about you." You know, and there was that sense of I was taking all of this and not giving anything back. And I suppose that's what I mean, that in terms of our role, we are human beings, we have got something to give back. We have to listen, yes, we need to be curious. We need to make space for change, make space for many voices. But as human beings, we have a responsibility to share our experiences as well. So, and I don't want to lose sight of that, because that's what expertise for me is about. It's knowing about stuff, but it's also being a human being in the world and being active and having a role to play.
Yeah, that's really, you don't want to be like the woman from the museum who's come to take your story. And it's much more natural to have an exchange. So our third topic, I mean, it's been very subtle, but the theme of the conference is dissent this year. So I thought it would be nice to bathe in the idea of consent for a while, or of consent, that was Freudian, dissent for a while. As in, who should we be dissenting against? I think we've talked a bit about dissenting against government and politicians. Should we be dissenting against our own sector? Should we be, do we need to think a bit more? I mean, we've touched on it already, so maybe we do need to talk about a bit more about combating our own biases and the slightly monocultural aspect of the museum workforce. Who should we be aiming our dissent at, and should we be more confident about aiming it inwards? There's a microphone over there. Stop pretending you can't say it.
Well, I think we should go inwards, actually. Yeah. I mean, I think, I think that the monocultural thing, I mean, we can all just look around the room right now, and I think it speaks for itself. And I think that there's elements of the way that we're traditionally set up as institutions, and more crucially, how you move into those institutions that leaves a lot of people out. One of the things I've been thinking about a lot recently, and I'll kind of throw it out there, is for example, internships in museums. And here's a dissenting idea: what if tomorrow we all said, actually, the kind of model of internships where we flipped that on its head and we said we're not going to do that anymore, and we're going to do instead graduate recruitment programs that people come in and they get paid for 18 months and they work in different parts or maybe between different museums. And so I think we should reflect on some of the accepted norms of our institutions and how we might challenge those accepted norms so that we become much more accessible institutions.
And I would agree with that, because and I do think we need to look at ourselves internally. What I've observed within museums is that there's a lot of hierarchy and orthodoxies, and often I get told, but that's the way we do things. And I think a lot of what we've been discussing this morning requires us as institutions, and even that word is is not a good word, but as institutions to have a completely different mindset and a completely different way of being. So there is a sense that we need to challenge ourselves and to dissent in a way against those traditions that we have established over a long period of time.
Thanks. Yeah, I would agree with that. I think we were thinking a lot about class in this conference. I think that's a really, for me personally, it's a really big deal. And I think within our organisations, it's a really big deal. And we talk about participation and going out. I think there is a point about really looking at our team as a whole and thinking about the expertise, particularly of our visitor assistant teams, in our case, our finance officer. There's people throughout our organisation who are coming to museums very often because they are really passionate about the potential. They are really interested, but can't get beyond, for example, the visitor assistant position. So I think there's something about looking at ways in which we can create more entry-level positions, whether that's apprenticeships or internships or assistant roles, but then also looking at how we potentially might ring fence that. And I know for employment law reasons that's tricky, but I think we can look at how we really actively encourage our workforce to get onto a path. We're recognising that everyone is a professional in that everybody in our team is there because they're passionate. Certainly for our visitor assistants, their knowledge of our audiences, of our people, of our collections is extraordinary, but I think across the board it's not recognised, it's not valued. People are rarely consulted about where things go or the layout of exhibitions. So I think that we can make a change there. We can actively do something about that, and actively think about recognising who we have in our teams and how we can encourage that progression and that movement and that investment. But then also, how do we think about class really? And I don't want to make any assumptions about any of us or any of you, but we really need to think about that, about how we make it possible. We're challenged all the time, aren't we, about social mobility not being there, not being possible. But I think we can make it possible. But it requires us to be quite strategic about it and really thinking, first of all, about our organisations and the people that we currently employ.
So I like a bit of dissent. D with a small d, as an everyday dissent, always a little bit of grist in the mill, always just questioning and pushing and questioning and pushing. But I think in terms of, in a capital D sense, the dissent for the trust is to shift from being an organisation that primarily thinks about place first. We start with their places and then we think about how we get people to them and join them, to put people in the middle of it. So the dissent between that, sort of the tension between that. If you start with people, you actually end up with a very different kind of answer. But that challenge of bringing new people in, I just don't think that dissent in our own heads is not about lack of willingness. It is actually about doing some real proactive action around it, because our whole sector has talked about this for years. You're 40% less likely to get a job in the trust if you're from BME. You're 60% less likely to get a job in the trust if you've got a disability. I'm embarrassed by that. I am absolutely going to do something about that because that's not acceptable. That's a dissent that exists, and yet we don't even know we're doing it. It was just extraordinary to, I've been watching our own processes because we'll default to the expert actually. And the experts are coming from the community from which we are already coming from. So we're going to have to be really brave, and there is dissent in that. We're going to have to be brave and go outside of that. The things that we hold true to ourselves about being experts, about knowing our sector, we're going to have to be really brave and step outside of those. And if we don't do that, we've got all sorts of things now. We'll do blind recruitment. Will recruit for attitude rather than skills or experience. All of those things, they're going to have to be very proactive moving out of it. And I think, but that everyday dissent and constantly challenging for me is, I think, an interesting dynamic that keeps everyone feeling, on to the next thing.
Surely we're not already done with dissent. That's so I'm gonna throw over to questions in a second. So get your questions ready. I think we might have microphones for questions, but I'm sure if we don't, we can come up with some kind of solution. We can share. Oh yes, that's a good point. Well made. I guess I had one last question, actually, which was, because it would feel weird to have you all here and not talk about money at some point, great and terrible money, which is, and I did do a Twitter call out for questions, and I got different questions that sort of amalgamated a bit, but one is balancing all of these progressive and interesting and brilliant things that we all want to do with the brutal reality of a kind of dwindling public purse. And then also maybe added on to that a slight friction between the other sources of funding that we might go to are not necessarily as invested in that progressive agenda as we would like to be as organisations. So on one level, you're not getting as much of that public money, but on another level, maybe the kind of people that might have money for you would maybe not be on board with your values necessarily, and how you square that brutal circle.
I actually think that really brings you back to your first question, which was around participation. It is absolutely a circle. We've got to move from a place where we are consumers of something that the state will supply us to being part of a much, much bigger, much more expansive, ambitious thing where people are engaged in what we do and make a contribution. The Trust was set up to not set up a membership base, not, yes, to look after places, but it was actually about getting more people to want to support the beautiful places that are important to them. Actually, if my ambition almost would be to make the National Trust defunct. If everybody wanted and were playing an active part in looking after the beautiful places around them, we wouldn't be needed. So that's your ultimate goal, but you're only going to do that if you get people really engaged and inspired about doing it. Having said that, I'm not unrealistic. We've got a lovely membership model. It's all right. It's easy for you to say, Hilary. But actually, it's just as important to me. Our membership has grown massively over the last number of years, but it can't grow forever. So I'm actually more interested in the folk that are not, oh, I didn't say that, do not quote me in the press. I did not say I'm not interested in members. I'm very interested in members. But I need Members Plus. So I need more people to be engaged, and the financial support will come through, and the delivery of that stuff will come through the support from a much wider audience. That's why it's critical.
Money is a very dirty word, and it's a massive challenge for museums. And I think that part of the challenge, for me, as someone who's blown in, I thought I understood museums, and it's only moving into the sector and working with museums that I go, wow, actually museums are amazing. And I think that for us anyway, within National Museums Northern Ireland, part of what we're trying to do is look at our brand and look at what people believe us to be. And actually the Trust is really interesting, Hilary, because it's very much moved from being a what we do organisation, which I think people know what we do, but I don't think people always understand why we do it. And it's that cause, that why do we exist and why do we do it? And I believe that rather than talking to them about money and the fact we don't have money, if we can talk to people about why we exist, what we do, why we're relevant, then they will want to invest because they believe in our cause and they believe in our impact and what we can do in society. So,
I think it's a look. Money, resources is going to be perennial. It's going to always be. And you can never use it as a reason not to do something, but at the same time, you've got to think about the capacity of your organisation and what it can achieve within the resources that it has. But that said, you have to, if you want investment, you need to be able to talk about what it is that you do and the relevance of what you do and the big ideas that go with that. And I think at some point there is probably a need for us to reflect on the structures that we have and the ways that we work and how we can do that in a way that allows us to move towards being more participatory organisations and thinking about how different elements of what we do live across departments within the organisation as opposed to within one and so on. But that kind of change takes time and it takes reflection and but crucially, it's going back to both what Hilary and Catherine said. It's about being, people know what you do, but why you're doing it, and why is it so important. What, for example, in the case of the National Museum of Ireland, the collection that we're holding on behalf of the people of our country, what are we doing with that, and why, and how can they get to it, and how can they be involved? So getting those kinds of messages out, I think, is, but yeah, money, it's resources, it's always going to be, but I think that we need to challenge ourselves a little bit as well in thinking, I suppose sometimes we have a tendency to say we need more resources, but we're not very good at necessarily saying why that is. It's sort of, I don't know if there's a general, but people, it kind of comes across in, we need X number of more people. Or, for example, in Ireland, it's like, you've taken so much from us, we need to be back there again. But we need to really get into the nitty-gritty of why that is, and what we're doing, and how we're part of an overall picture. That it's not just about the museum, but it's about us and where we sit within that cultural, social piece of the country as a whole, and what we offer.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, I think that sense of why, it's not us saying why, it's all of our audiences, all of our population saying, this is why I visit the museum, this is why it matters to me in my life. And I'd like us to get to a point where people get that it's understood, that we're not having to campaign for museums in quite this way, that we've got to a point where people get why it's relevant and do feel that it belongs to them, and that they've got a voice, and that they're empowered within that space. So, if you do the circle, yeah, it's about your bottom line. It is about your bottom line, because people are coming and using the spaces. They're buying a coffee and a card. They're using your loo and putting a penny in the box. All of those things are really important. But importantly, they're saying, this matters in my city. This is what makes me proud of my city. It makes me want to be here. And I think that for me is the business case, and I think it's a really strong case in terms of talking with our funders, with our local councils, with Arts Council, with the broader funding environment, to be able to say this is relevant, this does matter, and by the way, this is what people are saying about us. So if we can make that transition, and I think importantly within our teams, just to go back to that thing about teams, we've got to be realistic. There's little movement in our organisations. There are not many jobs. If you're bringing up kids, it's difficult to move. You've got to move a whole other city if you want, another job in a museum. That's not practical. So it just means that the sort of circulation of roles, the new roles coming up, are few and far between, which is why we need to think about other opportunities. Are there small pockets of cash? You talked about Rasheen talked about small acts. Are there little pockets of cash that enable that development and enable people to really recognise the role that they've got in belonging? They belong, and they've got a role, all of us, in participation and in building relationships with people. For me, participation is about what we can do together, and that means all of our staff. It's not about the learning team, it's about all of our staff having a role. But that requires a lot of work, I think.
I just wanted to add one other thing to it, which was we had our leadership conference this week, and my chairman stood up and he said a really important thing, actually, which was, he called it trade, but what he basically was saying is the idea of commerce or business or trade or whatever you want to call it in the trust must not feel like a poor relation. He said our business people are just as much the heroes of the organisation as our conservators or our rangers. And he was absolutely spot on. The sense of slight embarrassment around money, that's not our core business, that's not our core cause, and that's just not right, because actually the person that sells the flapjack in my cafe is as important. Not only do they need to feel that they're playing an important part in fundamentally looking after the planet, but they need to deliver a great visitor experience, they need to make sure that that flapjack's looking really great, all of those things. So everybody that plays a part in these organisations has a part to play in the cause, but the business side of it is so crucially important, and they need to feel that they are being supported and valued as much as everybody else, and I think it's really easy to overlook that.
I might start on the resources piece. I think one of the things as well is how we measure our impact, and I suppose in one specific area, we often talk about visitor numbers, right? And we always talk about, well, how many visitor numbers? Oh, it's steadily increasing, so on and so forth. And I think that the kind of work that we're all talking about today, that participatory work, that engaging with communities, that being a platform, is not going to cause a spike in our visitor numbers. I mean, it's going to, you know, there's going to be more, but my point is that if as organizations we are going to engage in this kind of in-depth work, which I think is crucial for us to do, we have to be cognizant of the fact that we need different kinds of ways to measure that impact. And we also need to demonstrate that to the people who fund us in a different way. But more crucially, we need them to understand that that's the case and to buy into that and to say, okay, well, yeah, this wealth and work over 2 or 3 years is and how do we measure that impact, as opposed to saying visitor numbers going up by X percentage. But that's really behoving on us to make that point. And I think that we have some traditional ways that we measure impact that maybe we need to say, are they fit for purpose now in terms of what we're talking about doing right now? And how do we do that better?
Yeah. Weirdly, as a PR, this is like a massive conversation that's happening in the PR industry, where we used to measure value by, like, if I bought an ad this big, and now it's like, how can you quantify, because you're getting less engagement, but it's of a better quality, or sometimes you're going big, but it's like not what you would really want people to be seeing, you know, and it's like quite a dirty game.
Of what you're doing, you know, and that influence and impact, and
you kind of have to self-define, and then it feels like you're marking your own homework a bit.
Yeah, but I think it's also engaging in conversations. I think that the crucial thing, particularly, you know, within leadership and in museums, and it's come up here, is the why we're doing what we're doing. But we also, there's a role for us in terms of the people that we fund, particularly at a government level, that we need to engage them in what it is that we're doing and our ambition. It's, you know, we're having a wonderful conference here with fantastic ideas, and we should be bringing those people in and saying, look, you know, this is what we're doing, and this is where we want to move, and this is the value that we have. And, you know, I think you know, for us at the moment, it's been interesting in Ireland. We have this Creative Ireland piece, and, you know, say what you will about that, and lots of people have different opinions about it. But one of the things that's interesting is that the conversation around it is about well-being. It's about this idea. It's moving the model slightly from economic benefit to well-being. And I think that's an important one. And I think those are the kinds of areas that we need to push as organizations.
I think there's also quite a lot to learn from the environmental sector on this. They're way ahead of the heritage and cultural sector in terms of understanding those wider benefits, well-being being one of them. But actually, there's, you know, natural capital. Well, what's the equivalent for cultural capital? How you measure going forward is going to be something. But there's certainly a lot to learn from other sectors that are doing it better than us.
Yeah, cool. It's question time. Are there any questions? Oh, there's one over here at the back. Oh, you're gonna run. I feel like we should provide a kind of soundtrack as you run, or I could just do this terrible kind of open spot level dad gags I'm doing. There you go.
Hi, I'm Gail from Royal Museums Greenwich in London. I'm really interested in the question of why, how it relates to participation, and how it relates to programming and exhibitions in particular. We seem to be very good at saying, oh, let's do a gallery on this, and then inviting people in to help us produce that gallery. What we're not so good at is that question before you start. What should we do a gallery on? Should we do a gallery? What is our exhibitions programme about, and why are we doing it? So I'm interested in processes or examples where you've invited people in at an early stage and how you've managed to make that work.
I'm just thinking about some of the stuff we're just beginning to do now. We're establishing a group with community leaders in Sheffield called Our Voices, Our Lives, that invites people who currently don't use, they might have, you know, incredibly rich cultural lives, but don't come into the city centre and don't use the museum to kind of build long-term relationships with people, to begin to understand what we could do differently. And for us, it's not about a particular gallery. It's about actually what do we need to do differently and better to become more relevant and to become relevant for for people now, but for people in the future. And what we're hoping is that through that kind of getting to know people over a period of time, that confidence in being able to challenge the experts and to express a view will really make a difference to our programme and to future projects. So we've got some big things on the horizon that we're working towards. And for us, being involved with people who currently don't visit, I think that is quite important, because there's a reason why people don't visit, and that might be about perception. So for us, I think it's a real change in the way that we're thinking about it, and it's something that's involving our trustees, colleagues from across the organisation, and me. And I think that feels like it's a good move in beginning to think differently about having the conversation right at the very beginning, before you've got a budget and a deadline and a space.
It's something that's very close to my heart at the moment. In the previous organisation that I worked in, we had a group of people who were from a whole variety of sectors: education, communications, or community groups, media, and they met 4 to 6 times a year and effectively fed into the programming of the organisation in terms of what we actually did. And I'm looking at setting something similar up within the National Museum, but I think what's really important about that is actually the relationships, more so than, so it's about having a group of people that are maybe in some cases not using the space, but that are feeding in and that you're developing a relationship with over a particular time, and that effectively you acknowledge as having a role in the strategic development of the organisation. And I think that's really important as well, because I think the governance of our organisations traditionally are not something that allow wider groups in and access. And I think ways that we can think about to enable that are really important.
It's a really big question, and I guess it's a really long journey to get to that, what it ultimately we would be seeking to achieve. We've an interesting project that we've just kicked off called Kick the Dust, actually, and the Heritage Lottery Fund here are a really good partner for us, and it's engaging with young people, an audience which is quite difficult to engage, and bringing them into the museum, and it's asking them to look at the collections. It's looking at how they can make them more accessible using digital tools, but also taking them into the galleries and saying to them what works here and what doesn't work. And I think it is really important to begin that conversation with a much more diverse audience, as you can then think about, well, how do we develop into the future?
Yeah, I think we have to be honest, we're really only starting this. An interesting Crankside, the one that's been in the press, is one of the first examples of it, where we invited students from Newcastle University to do exactly what you've said. And I suppose it illustrates one of the challenges with it, because not everybody liked what they did. And so we're going to have to think about how to manage those kinds of conflicts. But it doesn't mean to say we're going to stop doing it. It's just going to mean that we're going to keep learning as we go through it. Of course, we've a huge community of volunteers who are, in many, many ways, people who are coming with their own views as to what and how our properties should be presented. And that, for me, is a huge opportunity to give our volunteers even more opportunity and say and ability to influence what and how the places are presented. So we're only starting, we're going to learn, but I think the thing is to keep the resilience and to keep the sort of faith with this is the right direction to go, even though sometimes it's going to be quite tricky.
Hi, my name is Clara from Liverpool Museums. We've talked a lot about how we are very left-wing and all Guardian readers during this conference. And we also talk a lot about valuing all workers, whatever grade they are. But one very right-wing trend that's currently existing in museums is privatization. And just a quick example, at the British Museum, you've got people who are directly employed, then you've got people who work for the British Museum Publication Company, people in the cafe work for Ben Hugo, the cleaners and the porters work for TSS, they are just transferred from Carillion that collapsed this year, the technician works for CBRE, and then you've got another private company doing the bag searches, and you've got a lot of agency workers from artisan people. So is it time to dissent against privatization, and what is your view as a director?
I went first at the very beginning, so...
See, all that sisterhood is out the window. That is a really great question. I think I would always say that we need to behave more like businesses, which I'm expecting a big boo for, but we do need to behave more like businesses, and I think that means that we have to sometimes outsource our activity. I mean, for us, we don't have, we do have a firm that does our cleaning. We do have currently a franchisee that's linked to Benugo that do our catering. And what I think we have to look for is making sure that the terms of employment and the way that staff are looked after and wages, that they're appropriate. And we have to have that discussion. But really, we have to be businesses. And if that means sometimes that you're bringing in other firms that can do it better, then, you know, I think that is what we have to do. I think the real challenge, though, is making sure that, as I say, that people are looked after. But in order for us to function, we must behave like businesses. We must get out there and get the best deal for the funds that we have. And we must drive a hard bargain. That shouldn't be at the expense of our people. You know, it shouldn't be about people's terms and conditions or the wages that they're paid. But we must enter that environment. I think it's naive to think that we're not going to engage with business.
Yeah, I think I would agree with Kim. I think, you know, and privatization, so I mean, I think it's a bit more nuanced than that, than just privatization overall. I think that we have to behave as businesses. I think that the most crucial thing, though, is that the terms of employment and how people are working and how they are treated is at the best possible way, and that team works cohesively. So there's, you know, I think that's where we need to start. And again, I would go back to the values of the organization as being the thing that guides that the most. So yes, we have to behave as businesses. It would be, as Kim says, naive of us to think that we weren't, but we should be doing that true to the values of our organization and our values as a museum, and within the cultural sector and what that means.
There's also an assumption within the question, I suppose, that privatisation bad, public good. And I think that's wrong, actually. I think some of our most exciting partnerships with the Trust has been with the private sector. They've brought more innovation, more exciting provocation to us than I've found within my own organisation in many cases. So I think you've got to break out of that box is the first one. But I think the important thing is that as an organisation, you can stay true to what it is that you want to achieve. Now, if that's about independence or if that's about value-based, whatever it is, that whatever the model, and actually I've seen public ownership being much more constrained than private in terms of, you know, putting constraints as to what you can do or what we can do. So I think private can be actually really brilliant and liberating and provide some money and provide lots of good things. So yeah, changing the paradigm of that I think is important.
And I think it's also about organising. So for example, in the National Museum of Ireland, we have a really active union, which is a wonderful thing. And I cherish that. We work really well together. It's a really important relationship. And it's making sure that as organisations that you have in place the checks and balances so that as you face into difficult business decisions and move forward, because it is, you know, it's a difficult environment, it's a difficult sector, we're short on resources, but that as an organisation you make sure that you have the governance and the systems in place so that as you move through that as the leader of an organisation, you have people like the woman who just asked us that question that are going to challenge you and say, is this the right thing? And making sure that you make space for that. So I think it's a very nuanced thing. I think it's something that we're all working, that, you know, we're all going to be working to. I think we have to be businesses, but I think we need to make sure that we do it to our values and make sure we have the checks and balances in place to make sure we do it the right way.
I mean, I don't have a huge amount to add to that, but I'll just say something because everybody has to have their turn. I think I I actually agree. To me, it comes down to how effectively are you running your business, because the more effectively you run your business, the more you have to invest in the things that you want to do and the things that are going to have a greater impact. And I think it's important that we privatise the right things and that we are very clear about the things we want to protect, so that we don't compromise on the experience of our visitors or our users and our audiences, but that actually we are maximising efficiency so that we can do more of the really good stuff that we do.
Brilliant. Due to the naughty and deep level of your questions, I think we're now at time. So we're going to have to draw it to a close, unfortunately. But thank you all so much for your attention and interest. Thank you to our wonderful directors, and I'm sure they're available for buttonholing after they escape from the stage.
Okay, thanks for that. Very interesting. I think a lot of conversations have been started rather than ended through that, so that's great. There are now sessions on social media, inclusion and online learning.